Overlord Season 4 may unfortunately be done, but there's still quite a bit to talk about from the episodes I didn't cover. Topics not entirely relevant to the invasion of the kingdom, but instead a lot of foreshadowing as to what might be next for Overlord. So, as we look at the power suit, the Black Scripture, and everything in between, I'm sure you'll start to realize that we've only just scratched the surface of the new world. There's a whole bunch of different directions the story could go, and it's that expansive unknown that makes the series' future look so promising. So, in order to make sure you don't miss out on any of it, let's take a look at what we missed from the first half of episode 10. Before we get started though, I'm super excited to promote today's sponsor, Tower of Fantasy, a massive open-world MMORPG that really shines with its anime aesthetic and seamless shared space multiplayer. With numerous bosses, raids, and environments to take on together, there's quite a bit to do in this expansive post-apocalyptic world of sci-fi, especially now that they've released more surprises awaiting in the Vera update. Alongside a massive desert with outposts, oases, sandstorms, and more, the Vera expansion also includes the floating cyberpunk city of Meroria, a beautiful contrast to its desolate exterior that also brings with it numerous areas with brand new story quests and world bosses. So, as you continue to help Nemesis find their brother, a new final boss will be waiting at the end, along with some cyberpunk-themed vehicles to help you get through it. Then, with a couple new characters joining the roster, you can either unlock Cobalt B and her flaming revolver, or go for the brand new Ruby and her high damage dealing rabbit drone, both of which come with their own story quests to develop them better. Plus, in just a little while longer, you'll also be able to get Lynn and her elegant Shadow Weaver fan. So, combine all this with a brand new challenge mode called the Gray Space, and what you get is a massive amount of content to keep you entertained for months. It's an enormous update that comes out today, one that you can get many rewards for just playing, including up to 70 free gacha pulls. So, if you're looking for a beautiful open-world MMORPG, then I can't recommend enough using the link below to try out Tower of Fantasy. It's completely free and can be played on both mobile and PC, also now available on Steam as well. But now, let's get back to the video. Episode 49, Part 1, Drops of Red, covering chapters 2 and 3 from volume 14 of the light novel. With Azith's power suit having surprised AINZ at the coastal city, he immediately began to explain everything he knew about it to the Floor Guardians. This wasn't an item that started off in the base version of Yggdrasil, but was instead added after as a way to bring new players to the game. In a time when robot battles had become quite the trend, the devs behind Yggdrasil felt that they needed to capitalize on it. So, in order to not miss out on an easy influx of players, they had added these high-spec suits which made the learning curve a whole lot easier. By making them much stronger than a new player's base character, not only would the suit be more than just this skin taking advantage of a trend, but it would also make the daunting task of traversing Yggdrasil significantly easier. It was a double-faceted move I'm sure appealed to a lot of new players. So, some of the features these suits were equipped with was an inherent ability to fly at a speed faster than that of the fly spell, delve underwater for periods of over an hour, then withstand pretty much all environmental damage without any serious performance degradation. Combine this with the ability to use whatever spells and weapons you want, and what you get is a more simplified version of Yggdrasil. The ultimate tool for noobs which practically removes the grind, all while placing you right into the excitement. Then, just like everything else in Yggdrasil, so too were these power suits customizable via data crystals. You could either spend money and gain the data crystal immediately, or spend numerous hours adventuring and hope to find one that way. Either way, every ligament of the suit was capable of being equipped with its own unique attack spells, all of which could be activated at will by the operator, as well as range from tier 1 to tier 10 in strength. That didn't mean they could use a tier 10 spell as much as they wanted, but it did provide them the ability to use magic their builds normally wouldn't allow them to. The only caveat was that the stronger the spell, the less number of times they could use it per hour. When it did come time to modify the spells being used though, that's when you'd need a data crystal. So unless you were pay to win or already had an expansive supply of data crystals at your disposal, you were limited to only the spells the suit was currently equipped with. Now, with the suit overriding the user's physical, magic, defense, and evasion stats, that meant that even if you were a weak player, just equipping the suit would make you exponentially stronger. Then, where the suit does fall short though, is its inability to be worn with any other armor, along with a restriction that made any of its spells unable to be boosted by skills. As for its biggest weakness, well, that stems from the fact that the user's base HP and MP aren't overwritten by the suit. So, if the person using the suit was just a level 1 human, then any attack capable of punching through the suit's inherent defenses would be directly afflicted to the user and likely one-shot them. It was a rather glaring flaw that embodied the term glass cannon. That being the case, even with Azuth likely being boosted up to the level of the Pleiades, he was absolutely no threat to any of the Guardians. Unless he had a kit of tier 10 spells that were specialized for facing them, any serious attack would probably kill him instantly. Plus, with the best power suits only going up to about level 80, there really wasn't much for AINZ to worry about here. Sure, there could be some other intricacies that AINZ didn't really know about, but these power suits definitely weren't useful to anyone already at the level cap, especially since for someone like AINZ, they would heavily restrict the number of spells he could use. That's why he never took an interest in them when they launched in Yggdrasil. The one guild member who did though was the guild's go-to blacksmith Amanuma Hitotsu. As a player whose build specialized in crafting over any type of combat, he had found the idea of a power suit to be quite promising. Since it was a customizable item that allowed even him to fight, he was actually quite eager to get one and test it in combat, especially since he'd been dabbling in this aerial combat game recently. When he faced Peroronchino and lost pretty badly though, the 2 to 3 suits that he'd been experimenting with were shoved into the treasury and never seen again. He had abandoned the idea of using these suits to fight at the same level as everyone else in Nazarick. So, it was as AINZ remembered this fond memory of the past that a sudden connection was made which made him realize something. If this power suit from Yggdrasil had made it into the hands of an adamantite adventurer, then what's to say that the same thing didn't happen with the Blue Rose's Blackblade? Since both were rather powerful weapons that seemed out of place in the New World, it wasn't too far-fetched to think that the Blackblade had a similar history to the power suit. I mean, for a weapon that was supposedly capable of leveling an entire city, it's very possible it could have come from the same place the power suit did, especially since the owners of both were said to be relatives. Of course, that could just be a coincidence, but the likelihood of 2 adamantite relatives stumbling upon extremely powerful New World gear by chance wasn't something AINZ could just dismiss like that. It was actually something he really wanted to investigate. He didn't think the Blue Rose's Blackblade could one-shot any of the Guardians, but that also wasn't something he could just dismiss as impossible either. You see, if the blade truly did become stronger with the more of herself Lacus gave, then AINZ was very curious to see what the sword's full strength would be. So, if there did ever come a time when he had to face Lacus in a fight, rather than face the unknown extent of her power head-on, he would instead summon wave after wave of monsters, then force Lacus into releasing her full power prematurely. Assuming that full power did have a cooldown, that's when AINZ would step in and finish her off himself. Considering this was one of the biggest unknowns in the kingdom though, AINZ preferred not to have to deal with it now. He would definitely kill them if they stood in his way, but unless they actually made an effort to disrupt him, he would instead leave them alone until he knew more about what this Blackblade was capable of. Now, before we get to the scene with Zanuck next, I should briefly cover the intermission that introduced a brand new country and setting. It's not incredibly important right now, but it does probably foreshadow one of the major arcs in the future. So, where we find ourselves in the intermission is the city of Baybard from the Carcinus City Alliance, a nation once consisting of a single massive country but was eventually split into 12 smaller countries. With the average hosting about 400,000 people, the core thing this alliance was known for was the array of multiracial cities formed around it. No single city was dominated by a single race, and the highest concentration of a single one was only about 40% of the total population. So, with such a variety of people and values creating the foundations of this country, it was only natural that some ideals would clash with others. You see, before this alliance was what it was, the single country it used to be was continuously fracturing. Every city was at war with another, and there was this constant merging and splitting of other ones. The event that finally calmed everything down was the Great Debate which resulted in the alliance we see today. A moment in history that may seem ancient to some, but for other more long-lived races it was more like yesterday. That being the case, in order to maintain the peace this Great Debate brought, a sports tournament was held every 5 years. It was a series of events similar to the Olympics, comprising of various spectacles to keep the people entertained. The event that was by far the most famous though was the legendary Connellier Proxy War, a giant brawl in which each country picked 10 of their best, then sent them to the battlefield to fight for the banner of peace. Whoever held this magic item at the end was determined the winner and given victory for their country, making this the most exciting and most viewed event out of all of them. So, for such a major spectacle, it was absolutely essential it go perfect in every way possible. You see, should the host country mess this up in even the slightest, then any and all reputation they previously possessed would go right down the toilet. And that's what we see Kista of the city of Baybard trying to prepare for here. She was starting the planning phase for this Canelier, which would be happening in 4 years from now. Switching back to the main story now, and that's when we get to Zanuck and his takeover of the kingdom. It wasn't something explicitly mentioned in the story, but the reasoning behind it was clearly defined during this scene here. Shortly after the war began with AINZ, King Ramposa's lack of news from the border had made him assume that Albedo's declaration was just a threat. He didn't believe the Sorcerer Kingdom would actually attack them. So, while AINZ was quietly and efficiently toppling the border to the north, the king remained docile and continued to negotiate. Well, at least he tried to. He had simply sat back while cities were wiped out and done absolutely nothing while his people were slaughtered. It was an unforgivable sin that made him unworthy of the throne. So, once the news arrived that their borders were already taken, this unpardonable mistake that cost lives and cut off reinforcements was more than enough for Zanuck to gain the backing of the ministers and the military. He had gained the power he needed to take matters into his own hands. Of course, once Zanuck really got into the thick of it, the fact AINZ had taken so much ground without the kingdom finding out was a truly remarkable feat that he could only admire. Who knows what help or magic was required to achieve that, but all of it spoke volumes to the genius he was up against. If nothing else, this had to be a plan AINZ had spent multiple years coming up with. One that was covered by so many layers that even if one did happen to fall through, there would always be another to get caught up in. And that was the aspect that scared Zanuck the most. As the direct competitor to an enemy whose intelligence wasn't even fathomable, Zanuck couldn't help but feel that all his actions were being predicted. It was a futile situation in which the only path forward was the one that AINZ had clearly laid out for him. But even so, Zanuck still pushed forward with whatever little hope he could grasp onto. Like, with Marquis Raven definitely being one of the traitors, at least he could use that as a lead to gather some information. He likely wouldn't find anything from his investigations, but doing something was definitely better than doing nothing. That said, there was also the small hope the Marquis switched sides because he foresaw all this. If he knew the kingdom was going to be destroyed to begin with, then joining Nazarick and making his domain a refugee camp was definitely a smart move that could save numerous lives, especially since his city was one of the largest ones. With all other cities falling around him, it was only natural for survivors to run to the largest standing one. So it's very possible Raven foresaw the demise of the kingdom, then quickly switched sides in hopes of providing people a place to go. It was a nice thought that made Zanuck feel better about Raven's betrayal. Moving on to the scene with the blue roses next, and the mass amount of people remaining in the city was a prime indicator as to the choice they faced when confronted with the undead army approaching them. They could either flee the capital and head as far west as possible, or remain where they were and wait for things to blow over. 95% of the population chose to stay where they were. Once Lacus and the others had arrived, there was a cutscene that made Azuth look a bit more caring than he was in the anime. You see, despite being this physical embodiment of pompousness, he had still insisted that Lacus run away. Just like how he had warned his brothers, he was now warning Lacus that she didn't stand a chance. It didn't matter how many of them stood together to fight. If the enemy they were up against was the Sorcerer Kingdom, then Azuth knew the only thing awaiting them was death. He had tried to tell his brothers the exact same thing, but for some reason they insisted on staying. So, as their city was inevitably met by the invading forces of Nazarick, Azuth could only scoff at the ignorance that got them killed. Luckily, he was able to save their children, but the stubbornness of his brothers was a mistake he was hoping he could prevent Lacus from making here. Fast forward to the entrance of the Black Scripture now, and while most of this was pretty much the same, I'm sure a lot of you are wondering what they're capable of. Well, to give a brief summary of each, the leader of this mission was the 5th Seat Qua, a man many refer to as the one-man army, mainly because his summoner and beast tamer specialties make him strong against a large number of enemies. He also just so happens to be Clementine's brother. The menacing old man next to him was the Black Scripture's 10th Seat, the Strongest Man, a barbarian whose power was said to be the greatest out of everyone here, even more so than Yaldabaoth's Scale Demon. The one whose magical power can rival that, though, is the 11th Seat and her hero-level abilities, a woman that goes by the nickname Infinite Magic. Then, the last person to join was the mysterious assassin whose abilities surpassed both Tia's and Tina's, the 12th Seat who's often referred to as Tenyo Tenge. Now, what's interesting to note about all of them is that not only were each present during the battle with Shaltir, but each is also more than capable of beating every adventurer in the room here. When it comes to the realm of humans, they truly are the ones to stand above as its ultimate warriors. Now, the last thing to talk about, which was rather important, was the mention of a certain name that went to anger the Black Scripture. Right before they were about to leave, Azuth had gone to mention someone by the name of Rufus. A name the Black Scripture initially tried to feign ignorance of, but the instant Azuth referred to Rufus as this secret undead, every Black Scripture member looked about ready to kill him. The level of hostility had ramped to the point that no one could even move. If it wasn't for the orders of the 5th Seed Qua, then both Azuth and the Blue Roses next to him would definitely have been killed just for knowing the Theocracy's secret. That's just how much the mention of Rufus seemed to bother them. Fortunately for them though, the bluff Azuth was making here was something that they could capitalize on. You see, despite Azuth being the weakest one here, he knew he could say whatever he wanted since the Black Scripture was counting on them to face off against the Sorcerer King. If they could at least pull off a little bit of damage, then the value of leaving them alive would far outweigh the value of killing them here. Thus the reason they let them go unscathed. But yeah, that's pretty much what we missed from the first part of episode 10. Instead of development revolving around the invasion, there was quite a bit focusing on the world around it, a lot of which I'm sure AINZ will eventually make his way into. Now, as for what's next, I'll be making that video I was talking about for Philip. Then after that I'll eventually get to the video on Victim and Gargantua. So be sure to stick around for when those come out. Until then though, as always, thank you so much for watching, and if you enjoyed this type of anime content, then you already know what to do. So until next time, ciao!